The Galactic Dominion's council chamber was filled with laughter. Holographic displays showed Earth's warships, bulky, battered, and ugly. Compared to the sleek, elegant vessels of the Dominion, human ships looked like relics from a forgotten age. High Admiral Xorvik smirked as he addressed the gathered alien leaders. Humans, they fight with scrap metal and desperation. This will be over in hours. The room erupted with amusement. The Dominion's fleet was the most powerful in the galaxy, its warships a product of centuries of technological refinement. How could a species as young and unremarkable as humanity pose any kind of threat? But not everyone was laughing. Kel Rin, a strategist from the Dominion's intelligence division, watched the footage with narrowed eyes. She had studied humanity's history, their wars, their resilience. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice cutting through the laughter. "Humans don't fight like anyone else. They're unpredictable, and when cornered, they're dangerous." Her words were met with amused glances. Xorvik shook his head. "Let them come. They'll burn like all the others." The Dominion fleet arrived at Vesta Prime, a human colony rich in resources. They expected the usual, a few outdated human ships putting up a weak defense before crumbling under superior firepower. They spread out in a battle formation, weapons charged, targeting systems locked on the human fleet. And then, human ships arrived. There weren't many of them. Small, unremarkable vessels compared to the Dominion's titanic dreadnoughts. But something was off. The alien sensors flickered. The targeting systems struggled to lock on. Then, without warning, the human ships simply vanished. Confused murmurs spread through the Dominion command ships. "What just happened?" Xorvik demanded. Before anyone could answer, the first Dominion warship exploded. The battle erupted into chaos. Out of nowhere, human ships appeared, firing precision strikes at critical weak points. Dominion vessels that had once seemed invincible were torn apart like paper. Captain Rourke, the commander of the human fleet, smirked as he directed his forces. "They think we're primitive," he said over the comms. "Let's show them how primitives fight." Human ships moved unpredictably, using cloaking devices and advanced AI targeting. They weaved between enemy formations, striking and vanishing before the Dominion could react. Missiles slammed into alien hulls, energy cannons sliced through their defenses. The Dominion's arrogance turned into confusion, then fear. Xorvik growled in frustration. "Titan formation. Crush them." The Dominion warships adjusted, bringing their full firepower to bear. Their energy cannons lit up the battlefield, massive beams of destruction cutting through space. Human ships started taking hits, exploding one by one. On the human flagship Valkyrie, Rourke's second-in-command, Bonner, grimly analyzed the battle. "We're losing ships too fast." Rourke clenched his jaw. "Then we push harder." Bonner knew what that meant. No retreat, no surrender, just relentless, brutal combat. He nodded and relayed the order. The human fleet fought like cornered wolves. They used debris fields as cover, hijacked Dominion signals to scramble their communications, and turned every disadvantage into an opportunity. The Dominion had expected an easy victory. What they got was a bloodbath. But the numbers were against humanity. The Dominion brought in their dreadnoughts, massive, terrifying war machines that dwarfed human vessels. Their weapons could tear through entire cities in a single blast. The battlefield lit up as they fired, unleashing destruction. On the surface of Vesta Prime, humans fought desperately. Civilians huddled in underground bunkers as alien ground troops descended. Human Marines engaged them in brutal close-quarters combat, using guerrilla tactics to compensate for their lack of numbers. Bonner's ship took a direct hit. Alarms blared as fires spread through the decks. "Rourke, you need to fall back," Bonner coughed through the comms. Rourke's face was unreadable. He knew what had to be done. "You did good, Bonner," he said. Bonner gave a small smile before his ship was engulfed in flames. The loss sent a wave of fury through the human fleet. There was no more hesitation, no more restraint. They fought with a level of desperation and rage the Dominion had never faced before. Rourke made his decision. Deploy the Valkyrie. The Valkyrie was humanity's last hope. A prototype battleship equipped with experimental weapons, it had never been tested in real combat. If it failed, humanity would fall. But there was no choice. The Valkyrie surged forward, weapons glowing. It cut through the Dominion lines like a blade through flesh. The Dominion fleet scrambled to counter, but it was too late. The ship unleashed a massive energy pulse, overloading enemy shields. Human fighters exploited the opening, striking deep into Dominion formations. On the ground, human forces pushed forward. A squad of Dominion battle droids moved toward a shelter filled with civilians. A lone human Marine, wounded, bleeding, stood in their path. He had no backup, no chance of survival, but he raised his rifle anyway. The fight wasn't over yet. Sorvik watched his fleet crumble in disbelief. "Impossible," he whispered. His flagship was one of the few still standing. He could still turn the tide. He targeted the Valkyrie, charging his ship's main weapon. But Rourke had anticipated this. The Valkyrie activated its cloaking field one last time, teleporting directly above the Dominion flagship. "Fire everything," Rourke ordered. The Dominion flagship was ripped apart in a storm of explosions. Sorvik never had time to react. His ship, once a symbol of invincibility, was reduced to burning wreckage. The remaining Dominion ships broke formation. Fear overtook them. They retreated, fleeing into the void. The mighty Dominion fleet had been shattered. The battle was over. On the surface, human soldiers stood victorious. The lone Marine who had defended the shelter lay motionless, his rifle still clutched in his hands. Around him, the shattered remains of the Dominion droids. The civilians he had saved wept over his body. On the Valkyrie, Rourke stood in silence as the names of the fallen were read. Bonner's name was among them. He closed his eyes. They had won, but at a cost. Across the galaxy, news of the battle spread. The Dominion's arrogance had been their downfall. No one laughed at human ships anymore. A final message was broadcast from Earth to the Dominion's leaders. "You called us primitive, weak. Never make that mistake again. Next time, we won't show mercy." The Galactic Council watched in stunned silence. No one dared to laugh. The void of space erupted in chaos. Human ships appeared like ghosts, flickering in and out of sight, striking with brutal precision. They moved with a speed and ferocity that the Galactic Dominion's fleet hadn't anticipated. One moment the alien vessels floated in formation, sleek and powerful. The next, they were fireballs drifting in the dark. On the human flagship Valkyrie, Captain Rourke stood calm and focused. His eyes stayed locked on the battle map, where friendly and enemy ships danced in a lethal ballet. Every move he made was calculated. Every order was delivered with cold precision. His voice was steady as he spoke to his crew. "They called us scrap," he said, a faint smirk curling his lips. "Let's show them what scrap can do." The human fleet attacked with a savagery the Dominion had never seen. Missiles rained down like falling stars, streaking across the blackness and slamming into enemy ships with devastating force. Lasers carved through the void, searing bright lines of destruction. Human ships weaved through the enemy formation with daring, fast-paced maneuvers. Exploiting every weakness, they struck engines, weapon systems, and command bridges, taking out the most vital parts of their enemies with surgical precision. The Dominion's confidence cracked. On the bridge of the Dominion dreadnought Vorik's might, Admiral Sorvik's fury boiled over. "Where are they?" he bellowed, his claws digging into the armrests of his command chair. "Find them and destroy them." But the human ships were impossible to pin down. They used advanced cloaking devices, disappearing from sensors only to reappear in the perfect position to strike. Their eye-assisted targeting systems locked onto critical points with terrifying accuracy. Every shot counted, every hit mattered. A Dominion cruiser exploded just off the dreadnought's starboard side, sending debris spinning through the fleet. Another ship lost its engines and began to drift helplessly. A third took a direct missile strike to its weapons bay. The resulting chain reaction tore it apart from the inside out. The panic spread quickly. "They're targeting our weak points," one of Sorvik's officers cried. "They shouldn't know." "They know," Sorvik growled, his eyes blazing. He turned toward his communications officer. "Order the fleet to tighten formation. We outnumber them. Crush them with sheer firepower." But the humans didn't give them the chance. A squadron of human fighters swooped down on the Dominion's rear lines, unleashing a barrage of missiles. Explosions rippled through the fleet as smaller ships were picked off one by one. Before the Dominion could retaliate, the fighters were gone, disappearing into the blackness once more. On the Valkyrie, Rourke watched the carnage with grim satisfaction. "They're breaking," his second-in-command, Lieutenant Hale, reported. "Their formation's falling apart." "Good," Rourke said. "Let's keep it that way. Send the Tempest and Ironclad around their flank. We'll hit them from both sides." The two human warships peeled off from the main fleet, moving like shadows. The Dominion never saw them coming. They opened fire from the rear, catching the enemy in a deadly crossfire. Alien ships burst into flames, their defenses overwhelmed. But the Dominion wasn't beaten yet. Sorvik's flagship turned its massive guns toward the human fleet. Energy cannons began to charge, gathering power for a devastating strike. The air on the Valkyrie's bridge grew tense as the readings spiked. "They're targeting us," Hale warned. "Not for long," Rourke said. "Bring the Valkyrie around. Prepare the railguns." The human ship swung into position, its experimental weapon systems powering up. The railguns hummed with energy, their payloads locked onto the enemy flagship. "Fire!" The Valkyrie's railguns roared. Hypersonic projectiles tore through the void, striking the Dominion dreadnought's shields with incredible force. The first volley shattered their protective barrier. The second ripped into the hull, sending shockwaves through the massive ship. But Sorvik wasn't going down without a fight. The dreadnought's main cannon fired. A blinding beam of energy lanced across space, heading straight for the Valkyrie. "Brace!" Rourke shouted. The ship shuddered violently as the beam struck. Consoles sparked and alarms wailed. The lights flickered, and for a moment, it felt like the entire vessel might come apart. "Damage report," Hale called out. "Shields are gone," an officer replied. "Hull integrity at 60%. Rourke's jaw tightened. "We're not done yet. Target their engines. Fire everything we've got." The human fleet responded with fury. Missiles, lasers, and railgun rounds poured into the Dominion flagship. Explosions bloomed across its surface. The engines sputtered and died. The massive ship began to list, powerless and burning. Still, the Dominion kept fighting. Their remaining ships rallied, launching a desperate counterattack. Human vessels took heavy damage. The Tempest was hit by a torpedo, its aft section breaking apart in a fiery explosion. The Ironclad vanished in a burst of light as enemy cannons found their mark. But the humans didn't retreat. They pressed forward with unrelenting ferocity. On the ground of Vesta Prime, human Marines fought their own desperate battle. Alien troops poured into the colony, heavily armored and well-armed. But the humans were ready. They fought from the shadows, using guerrilla tactics and ambushes. Every street became a battlefield, every building a fortress. One Marine, bleeding and battered, stood his ground against an entire squad of Dominion soldiers. He had no hope of survival, but he refused to back down. His rifle spat fire until the very end. When his body finally fell, it was surrounded by the corpses of his enemies. In orbit, the tide of battle shifted. The Dominion fleet was crumbling. Human ships closed in from all sides, hammering their enemies without mercy. The Valkyrie fired its final volley, and Sorvik's flagship disintegrated in a brilliant explosion. The Dominion's morale shattered. The remaining ships broke formation and fled. Humanity had won. But the victory came at a cost. On the Valkyrie's bridge, the list of casualties scrolled across the screen. So many names, so many lives lost. Rourke stood in silence, his heart heavy. But there was no regret. They had fought for their survival, and they had prevailed. Across the galaxy, the news spread like wildfire. The invincible Dominion had been defeated by a species they had mocked. No one laughed at human ships anymore. And when the next Dominion fleet came, humanity would be ready. Admiral Sorvik's rage boiled over as the human fleet continued to dismantle his forces. The arrogance that had filled the Dominion's high command was gone, replaced by fear and fury. He rose from his command chair, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Enough of this. Deploy the dreadnoughts. The order sent a shiver through the Dominion fleet. The dreadnoughts were monstrous. Massive warships with the firepower to reduce entire planets to ash. As they emerged from the formation, their size alone cast long, terrifying shadows across the battlefield. Their weapons began to charge, the hum of destructive energy filling the void. On the Valkyrie, Captain Rourke's calm mask remained, but tension rippled through his crew. The sight of those massive ships made even the most seasoned veterans pale. Lieutenant Hale's voice cracked as she reported, "Sir, the dreadnoughts are moving into position. If they get a firing solution on Vesta Prime." "They won't." Rourke cut her off, his voice steady. "But we need to hit them hard. Now." The human fleet surged forward, but the dreadnoughts answered with brutal force. Their cannons unleashed torrents of plasma and energy, each shot capable of tearing through multiple ships. Human vessels began to fall, fast and hard. The Tempest exploded in a burst of fire and debris. The Ironclad followed moments later, its hull shearing apart under a relentless barrage. On the Valkyrie, the damage reports flooded in. "We're losing too many ships," Hale shouted. "We can't hold this line." But one voice cut through the chaos. Strong, determined. "We hold," said Commander Bonner, Rourke's second-in-command. His face was resolute on the comm screen. "We hold the line." And then Bonner made his choice. The Resolute, Bonner's ship, broke formation, charging headlong toward the nearest dreadnought. Warnings blared across the comms, but Bonner ignored them. "If they want a sacrifice," he said, his voice calm, "I'll give them one." "Bonner, stand down." Rourke barked, but there was no stopping him. The Resolute took hit after hit, its hull breaking apart, but it never slowed. In its final moments, the ship's engines flared, and it slammed into the dreadnought's weapons array. The resulting explosion tore through the massive ship's systems, sending shockwaves through its structure. The dreadnought staggered, its guns falling silent. Bonner was gone. The silence on the Valkyrie's bridge was heavy. Hale's voice broke as she whispered, He did it." But there was no time to grieve. The Dominion pushed forward with renewed fury, and their revenge was swift. From orbit, the dreadnoughts began bombarding Vesta Prime. Great beams of energy lanced through the atmosphere, striking the colony below. The night sky was set ablaze with fire and destruction. Entire districts vanished in the blink of an eye. The ground shook with each impact. On the surface, human ground forces fought desperately. Outnumbered and outgunned, they made their stand in the burning ruins of their cities. Marines dug in, their weapons blazing as waves of alien soldiers descended upon them. Sergeant Lyle gritted his teeth as his squad held the line at the edge of a collapsing street. "We're getting chewed up out here," he shouted into his comm. "We need support." "Hold your position, Sergeant," came the reply from command. "We're working on it." But the support never came. A Dominion walker, a towering six-legged war machine, crashed through the ruins ahead of them. Its cannon swiveled, and the street was engulfed in fire. Lyle's squad scattered, but the casualties mounted. In the midst of the chaos, civilians ran for shelter, their cries piercing through the noise of battle. A mother shielded her child as debris rained down. An elderly man fell, his hand outstretched as others tried to pull him to safety. The human forces fought not just for their own survival, but for those who couldn't fight at all. From orbit, Rourke watched the destruction unfold, his fists clenched at his sides. "We have to stop this," he said. "We have to take those dreadnoughts down." Hale's voice was desperate. "Sir, we don't have the firepower." "Then we make them bleed," Rourke growled. "All ships, focus fire on the lead dreadnought. Take it out, no matter the cost." The human fleet obeyed. Missiles and railgun rounds streaked toward the massive warship. Explosions blossomed across its hull, but the dreadnought kept firing. Its cannons rained destruction on Vesta Prime, and every second counted. "Incoming fire," Hale shouted. The Valkyrie shuddered as it took a direct hit. Consoles sparked, and the lights flickered, shields failing. An officer reported, "Hull breaches on multiple decks." But Rourke didn't back down. "Keep firing." The lead dreadnought began to falter. Fires spread along its surface. Secondary explosions rocked its hull. Finally, with one last barrage from the Valkyrie, its reactor went critical. The massive ship erupted in a blinding explosion, pieces of it scattering into space. On the ground, the bombardment lessened. The human forces pushed back, their morale surging. Lyle's squad rallied, taking down the Walker with a hail of rockets. Civilians began to escape, finding safety in the moments bought with blood. But the fight wasn't over. 2 more dreadnoughts remained, and the human fleet was running out of time. Rourke stared at the battlefield, the weight of command heavy on his shoulders. The cost had already been terrible. Friends lost, ships destroyed. But they couldn't stop now. "Prepare for the next wave," he said. "We end this, one way or another." The bridge of the Valkyrie was a mess of flashing lights and warning sirens. Smoke filled the air, and the crew worked desperately to keep the ship together. Captain Rourke stood at the center, his face set in grim determination. The human fleet was all but gone, reduced to a handful of battered ships, struggling to hold back the alien onslaught. The Dominion's dreadnoughts still loomed, and Vesta Prime burned beneath them. "We're not going to last much longer," Hale shouted over the chaos. "The fleet's down to 15% strength. We can't hold." "We don't have to hold," Rourke said, his voice low and dangerous. "We just have to hit them where it hurts." He turned to the weapons officer. "Is the Valkyrie's payload ready?" The officer hesitated. "Sir, those weapons haven't been fully tested." "Ready or not," Rourke interrupted, "they're all we've got." The Valkyrie wasn't just another battleship. It was humanity's last gamble, a prototype armed with experimental weapons so dangerous even Earth's military hadn't dared deploy them. And now, with the survival of their people on the line, they had no other choice. "Bring us in," Rourke ordered. "Full speed." The Valkyrie surged forward, engines blazing, straight into the heart of the enemy formation. The Dominion ships scrambled to respond, but the human vessel moved like a predator, fast, precise, and lethal. "Fire," Rourke commanded. The Valkyrie unleashed hell. A pulse cannon fired first, sending waves of concussive energy rippling through the enemy ranks. Smaller ships crumpled like paper. Missiles followed, streaking toward the dreadnoughts with deadly accuracy. Explosions bloomed across the void, but the Dominion fought back. Plasma beams lanced through space, narrowly missing the Valkyrie as it twisted and rolled through the enemy fire. The ship shuddered with every near miss, but Rourke didn't flinch. On the ground, the battle was just as brutal. The streets of Vesta Prime were soaked in blood and fire. Human soldiers fought with everything they had, rifles blazing, knives flashing in the dim light. Buildings crumbled under the relentless bombardment, and every inch of the colony became a battlefield. Sergeant Lyle's squad was pinned down in the ruins of a marketplace. "We're cut off," one of his men shouted. "We need to fall back." "There's nowhere to fall back to," Lyle snapped, firing his weapon into the advancing enemy. "Hold the line." But the line was breaking. Alien battle droids closed in, their metal forms gleaming in the firelight. Their weapons cut through human defenses with brutal efficiency. Then Lyle heard it, the panicked cries of civilians. He turned and saw them. A group of refugees huddled in a makeshift shelter, children clinging to their parents as the droids advanced. "Not on my watch," Lyle growled. He broke cover, charging toward the shelter. The droids turned, their weapons tracking him, but he was faster. His rifle barked, and 2 droids fell. He reached the entrance of the shelter, standing between the civilians and the enemy. "Stay down," he barked over his shoulder. The droids attacked. Lyle fought like a man possessed, his rifle spitting fire. When his ammo ran out, he drew his sidearm, each shot precise and deadly. When that was empty, he fought with his knife. But there were too many. A droid's blade slashed across his side, and he staggered. Another struck him in the leg, and he fell to one knee. Still, he fought. On the Valkyrie, the battle turned desperate. The ship's experimental weapons tore through the Dominion fleet, but the enemy's numbers were overwhelming. The hull groaned under the strain, and damage reports flooded in. "Shields down to 10%. Hale called out. "Hull integrity failing." Rourke's jaw tightened. "One last push," he said. "Target the lead dreadnought." The Valkyrie dove toward the massive ship, weapons blazing. Missiles found their mark, explosions ripping through the dreadnought's defenses. But the enemy wasn't done yet. A plasma beam struck the Valkyrie's side, sending the ship into a deadly spin. "Stabilize," Rourke shouted. "I'm trying." Hale's fingers flew across her console, engines failing. Another impact. The lights went out, and for a moment, there was only darkness. On the ground, Lyle made his last stand. Bloodied and battered, he stood over the civilians, his knife in hand. The droids closed in. "Come on, you metal bastards," he snarled. "Let's finish this." A droid raised its weapon and exploded. Lyle blinked as the remains of the droid scattered across the ground. More explosions followed, and the advancing enemy fell in waves. "Air support," someone shouted. Human gunships roared overhead, their cannons cutting through the enemy ranks. The tide was turning. On the Valkyrie, power surged back to life. Rourke's vision cleared as the emergency lights flickered on. "Captain," Hale said, her voice shaking, "we have one last shot." Rourke's eyes locked on the lead dreadnought. "Then let's make it count." The Valkyrie's weapons fired one last time. The experimental railgun unleashed a round of pure destruction, tearing through the dreadnought's core. The alien ship detonated in a brilliant burst of fire and debris. The Dominion fleet faltered. Their largest ships destroyed, their morale shattered. They began to retreat. On the ground, the remaining enemy forces broke and ran. Human soldiers cheered, their victory hard-won and well-deserved. Lyle sank to the ground, exhausted but alive. A medic rushed to his side, but he waved them off, his eyes on the civilians he'd saved. "You're safe now," he said, his voice rough but gentle. In space, the Valkyrie floated amid the wreckage of the battle. The cost had been high. Friends lost, ships destroyed, but humanity had endured. On the bridge, Rourke finally allowed himself a small, weary smile. "Let them laugh," he said softly. "We'll see who's laughing when the dust clears." The Valkyrie shook violently as another blast rocked the hull, the sound of metal groaning under pressure echoing through the bridge. Smoke filled the air, and warning lights flashed red, painting everything in a hellish glow. Captain Rourke gripped the railing tightly, his knuckles white, his face calm despite the chaos around him. "We're not going to last much longer." Hale's voice was a mix of fear and desperation. "Shields are down to 5%. Hull integrity's failing." Rourke didn't flinch. He kept his eyes fixed on the enemy flagship looming ahead. The alien vessel was a beast, massive, sleek, and bristling with weapons. It hovered like a predator, its energy cannon charging, a blinding sphere of light gathering at its core. On the enemy bridge, High Admiral Xorvik watched with a cruel smirk. "Your defiance ends now," "Human," he sneered. His voice echoed across the open comm channel. "You fought well, for primitives. But this is the end." The energy cannon glowed brighter. One shot, and the Valkyrie would be gone. Rourke's crew waited for his order, fear in their eyes. But Rourke wasn't done yet. "Hail," he said quietly, his voice steady. "Prepare the overload sequence." Her eyes widened. "Sir." "Do it," he snapped. "That's an order." She hesitated for only a second before her fingers flew across the console. "Overload sequence initiated," she confirmed, her voice trembling. "But if this doesn't work—" "It will," Rourke said firmly. The alien energy weapon reached critical mass, the air around it rippling with power. Sorvik leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "Goodbye, Captain Rourke," he said. "Not today," Rourke whispered. "Engage the cloaking field. Full overload. Now." The Valkyrie vanished. One moment it was there, and the next, nothing. The energy weapon fired, a beam of blinding destruction slicing through empty space. Sorvik's smug expression faltered as his shot missed completely. "Where did they go?" he roared. But the answer came too late. The Valkyrie reappeared directly above the alien flagship, so close that their hulls nearly touched. Rourke didn't hesitate. "Fire everything," he ordered. The Valkyrie unleashed hell. Every weapon they had, railguns, missile pods, plasma cannons, fired at once. The first volley tore through the enemy's shields. The second breached their armor. The third hit the core. The alien flagship erupted in flames, explosions ripping through its length. Debris scattered into space, and the once mighty vessel began to break apart. On the enemy bridge, Sorvik's last scream was cut short as fire consumed him. The alien fleet saw their leader's ship fall and panicked. The formation broke. Some ships fled, others fired blindly. But they had already lost the will to fight. On the surface of Vesta Prime, the site of the flagship's destruction was like a signal flare. Human forces, battered and bloodied, found new strength. "Did you see that?" A soldier shouted. "The fleet's winning," another cried. Sergeant Lyle, still bleeding and barely standing, raised his rifle. "Push forward," he roared. "Drive them back." The humans surged ahead. In the ruins of the colony, the battle turned. Alien forces began to retreat, their morale shattered. Human soldiers fought like demons, every step bringing them closer to victory. Rourke watched the enemy fleet scatter, his heart pounding. But the battle wasn't over yet. "Hail, status report." "Damage is severe," she said. "We're barely holding together. But, sir, we did it." He allowed himself a small, tired smile. "Not yet," he said. "Let's make sure they never come back." He turned to the weapons officer. "Target the remaining ships, one by one." The Valkyrie went to work. Weakened but relentless, it hunted the remaining enemy vessels. Missiles streaked through space, plasma cannons roared, and ship after ship fell. On the ground, the last of the alien forces were driven into a corner. Lyle led his squad forward, every step agony, but every shot true. A final group of battle droids made a stand, and fell beneath the humans' fury. When the last enemy dropped, silence fell. The fires still burned, the air still smelled of smoke and blood, but the fighting was done. Humanity had won. On the bridge of the Valkyrie, the crew erupted into cheers. Hale laughed, tears streaming down her face. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it." Rourke let the celebration wash over him, but his eyes remained on the wreckage of the enemy fleet. "They called us scrap," he murmured. "They underestimated us." He turned to his crew, his voice rising. "Let them spread the word. Let every species in the Dominion know. Humanity doesn't break. We don't surrender. And we never, ever stop fighting." The cheers grew louder. On Vesta Prime, the survivors gathered. Families reunited, soldiers embraced, and the dead were mourned. Lyle sat on the edge of the ruined shelter, his wounds finally treated, watching the sun rise over the battered colony. A small child approached him, the same one he had saved. She held a battered toy in one hand and looked up at him with wide, grateful eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Lyle smiled, the pain in his body nothing compared to the warmth in his heart. "Anytime, kid," he said softly. The war wasn't over. The Dominion would return. But for now, humanity stood tall, defiant, victorious, and unbroken. The smoke still rose from the ruins of Vesta Prime. Fires crackled in the distance, their orange glow reflecting off the twisted metal of destroyed buildings and shattered alien war machines. The air smelled of ash, scorched earth, and blood. The sounds of battle had finally faded, replaced by the quiet sobs of survivors and the low murmurs of soldiers counting their dead. Captain Rourke stood at the edge of a crater, his uniform torn and stained with soot and blood. His face was hard, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. The battle was over, but the cost had been steep. Behind him, the Valkyrie hovered in the sky, scorched and battered but still standing. It had done its job. They all had. The dead were being gathered. Rows of human bodies, wrapped in makeshift shrouds, lined the broken streets. Among them lay Commander Bonner. His loss cut the deepest. Bonner had been more than Rourke's second in command. He had been his friend. The funeral was simple but heavy. Soldiers stood at attention, their faces grim and their eyes hollow. The wind carried the sound of the eulogy across the field where the bodies lay. Rourke's voice was rough but steady. Commander Bonner gave his life so others could live. He knew the risks, and he never hesitated. He stood when others would have fallen. He fought when others would have fled. And in the end, he made the ultimate sacrifice. Rourke paused, his throat tight. He looked out at the gathered soldiers, seeing their pain reflected in his own. "We owe him everything. And we will honor his memory, not with words, but with action. We will rebuild. We will fight. And we will never forget." As the last words fell, the soldiers raised their weapons in salute. The sharp crack of gunfire echoed across the silent field. Bonner's coffin was lowered into the earth, and with it, a piece of Rourke's heart. But there was no time for grief. Not yet. In the aftermath of their victory, the Galactic Dominion's fleet had scattered. The mighty armada that had come to crush humanity had been shattered and driven back in disgrace. Reports confirmed their retreat, but Rourke knew they would return. And next time, they wouldn't underestimate the humans. The time had come to send a message. On the Valkyrie's battered bridge, the crew worked to restore their systems. The communications array flickered to life, connecting to the Galactic Council's central broadcast. Every world in the Dominion would see this transmission. Every leader, every soldier, every citizen. Rourke stood before the camera, his face calm and hard. The image of a human captain, bloodied and worn but unbowed, filled the screens of 1,000 worlds. He took a breath, and when he spoke, his voice was cold and steady. "You called us primitive," he began. "You called us weak. Scrap metal and desperation, you said. You laughed at us. And yet here we stand, while your mighty fleet lies in ruins." He let the words sink in. Across the galaxy, the laughter had stopped. "You thought this would be easy. You thought you'd crush us in hours. But you forgot one thing. Humanity doesn't break. We don't surrender. And when we fight with everything we have." The council chambers on the Dominion's capital world were silent. The same aliens who had sneered and mocked humanity now sat in stunned disbelief. The footage of their flagship's destruction played on repeat behind Rourke's image. "This was your warning," Rourke continued. "Next time, we won't show mercy." The transmission ended. In the council chambers, no one dared speak. High Admiral Sorvik was dead. Their most powerful fleet had been destroyed. And the humans, the so-called primitives, had done it. Kellerin, the only strategist who had warned them of humanity's danger, watched the silent faces of her fellow council members with grim satisfaction. "I told you," she whispered. On Vesta Prime, the rebuilding had already begun. Soldiers became workers, clearing debris and helping civilians. The wounded were tended to, the dead were honored, and the survivors clung to hope. Rourke walked through the ruins, his steps slow and heavy. He passed the orphaned children, the widowed spouses, the broken families. But he also saw resilience. Humanity had been bloodied, but they were far from beaten. Sergeant Lyle approached, his arm in a sling and his face lined with exhaustion. "Captain," he said, his voice rough, "the people are asking what happens next." Rourke looked out over the battered colony. "We rebuild," he said simply. "We prepare. And when they come back, and they will, we show them exactly why humanity survives." Lyle nodded, a grim smile playing on his lips. They won't know what hit them. The fires burned lower, and the first hints of dawn crept over the horizon. Humanity had faced the storm and survived. And when the next one came, they'd be ready.